My sister Sophia threw her bags into my living room and said, laughing, "Today we're the ones in charge." I stayed silent, watching as she surveyed my carefully organized space with the entitled satisfaction of a conquering general claiming territory. Behind her, Marcus, her boyfriend of 3 months who somehow acted like he'd known our family for decades, dragged in a suitcase that looked like it had survived several cross-country moves. "God, Bethany, this place is exactly what I expected," Sophia continued, running her manicured finger along my bookshelf and leaving a deliberate smudge on the glass. "So perfectly pristine, so desperately controlled. When's the last time you actually lived in this mausoleum instead of just existing in it?" I remained seated on my couch, hands folded in my lap, watching this invasion with the detached fascination of someone observing a natural disaster from a safe distance. Sophia had always possessed this particular talent, the ability to walk into any space and immediately claim ownership of it, to make everyone else feel like guests in their own lives. She was 32 to my 35, but had spent our entire childhood acting like the older sibling, the one who knew better, who deserved more, who could take whatever she wanted simply because she wanted it. Our mother had called it Sophia's natural leadership qualities. I'd learned to call it something else entirely. "Marcus, put the bags in the guest room," Sophia commanded, though I'd never mentioned having a guest room. In fact, I'd never mentioned having guests at all. The second bedroom in my duplex served as my office and art studio, carefully organized with canvases, brushes, and the half-finished painting that had been my salvation during the darkest months of the past year. "Actually," I said quietly, my voice cutting through Sophia's monologue about how much she'd missed family bonding time, "I don't recall inviting anyone to stay here." Sophia laughed, the sound sharp and brittle in the afternoon air streaming through my gauze curtains. "Oh, come on, Beth. Don't be dramatic. We're family. Besides, it's not like you're using the space for anything important. What do you do all day anyway? Paint your little pictures and pretend you're an artist." The casual cruelty of the comment hit exactly where she'd intended. Sophia had always possessed an uncanny ability to locate the most tender parts of people's souls and press down hard, then act surprised when they flinched. Marcus cleared his throat uncomfortably, clearly sensing the tension, but unwilling to choose sides in a battle he didn't understand. He was handsome in the generic way that Sophia's boyfriends always were. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of smile that suggested he'd never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with charm and good intentions. "Maybe we should have called first," he offered weakly, glancing between us like a tennis spectator following a particularly vicious match. "Nonsense," Sophia waved dismissively. "Bethany doesn't mind. Do you, Beth? Besides, we really don't have anywhere else to go right now. My landlord is being completely unreasonable about the rent situation, and Marcus's roommate is having issues with his girlfriend. We just need a few weeks to get back on our feet." A few weeks. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, acrid and suffocating. I knew from experience that Sophia's few weeks had a way of stretching into months, then years, until suddenly you were living in someone else's version of your own life. "I see," I said, standing up from the couch with careful precision. "And you assumed I'd be willing to house 2 adults indefinitely without discussing it first." "God, you're being so uptight about this," Sophia said, flopping down on my white sofa with deliberate carelessness. "It's not like we're strangers. We're sisters. This is what family does for each other. Family." The word tasted bitter in my mouth, loaded with 3 decades of expectation and disappointment, of giving until there was nothing left to give, and then being asked to give more. Sophia had always been excellent at invoking family when she needed something, then forgetting we were related when I might need support in return. "I'm going to get some fresh air," I announced, grabbing my keys from the hook by the door. "Make yourselves comfortable." As I walked toward my car, I could hear Sophia calling after me, "Bring back some wine, and maybe some of those fancy cheese crackers you like. We should celebrate being together again." I drove to the hardware store in silence, my hands steady on the steering wheel despite the storm building in my chest. For 35 years, I'd been accommodating Sophia's needs, adjusting my life to fit around her demands, allowing her to treat my space, my time, and my emotions like they belonged to her. Today, that ended. The locksmith arrived 45 minutes after I called, a weathered man named Tony, who'd probably seen enough domestic drama to write a book about human nature and door locks. He quoted me a price that would normally make me wince, but today felt like the best money I'd ever spent. "You want the deadbolt changed too?" he asked, examining my front door with professional assessment. "Everything," I replied firmly. I want completely new locks on everything. Front door, back door, even the gate to the backyard. And I want the kind that can't be picked easily. Tony raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. I appreciated that about service professionals. They understood that sometimes people needed to reclaim their territory without having to justify the decision to strangers. While he worked, I sat in my kitchen thinking about the pattern that had defined my relationship with Sophia since childhood. She would create a crisis, usually financial, sometimes romantic, occasionally legal, and then arrive at my doorstep with the assumption that I would solve it. Not ask me to solve it, mind you, but simply expect that I would rearrange my life to accommodate whatever chaos she'd generated. The first time, I'd been 16, and she'd been 13. She'd stolen money from our mother's purse to buy expensive makeup she'd seen older girls wearing, then lied about it when confronted. When the truth came out, she'd sobbed in my bedroom about how everyone misunderstood her, how she just wanted to fit in, how it wasn't really stealing because family money belonged to everyone. I'd given her my entire savings account, $300 from babysitting, to replace what she'd taken. She'd promised to pay me back within a month. I was still waiting. The pattern had repeated itself with variations throughout our 20s. Sophia would get evicted from apartments, fired from jobs, dumped by boyfriends, or simply decide she was bored with her current living situation. She'd show up at whatever place I was renting with her belongings, and an expectation that I would absorb the financial and emotional costs of her instability. And I always had, until 6 months ago. 6 months ago, I'd finally saved enough money to put a down payment on this duplex, my first real home, the first space that belonged entirely to me. It was small but perfect, with hardwood floors I'd refinished myself, walls I'd painted in colors that made me happy, and gardens I'd planted with flowers that bloomed according to my careful planning, rather than chaotic chance. This place was my sanctuary, my proof that it was possible to build something beautiful and stable, even when you came from a family that specialized in destruction. Every corner reflected years of careful saving, thoughtful choices, and the kind of patience that Sophia had never possessed. The guest room, Sophia had so casually claimed, was actually my art studio, the place where I'd finally given myself permission to pursue the painting that had sustained me through our mother's death 2 years ago. The canvases lining the walls represented hundreds of hours of work, thousands of dollars in supplies, and the fragile confidence I'd built in my own creative abilities. She'd looked at all of that, and seen only empty space waiting for her convenience. "All done," Tony announced, handing me a set of shiny new keys. "These are high-security locks, so anyone who doesn't have the key is going to have a very difficult time getting in." "Perfect," I said, testing each key in its respective lock. The mechanisms turned smoothly, with the satisfying click of barriers being established and maintained. After Tony left, I walked through my duplex, seeing it with fresh eyes. This wasn't just a house. It was a fortress I'd built against the chaos that had defined my childhood, the unpredictability that had followed me into adulthood, courtesy of family members who confused love with obligation. I'd spent years believing that setting boundaries with Sophia made me selfish, that real love required infinite accommodation and endless second chances. Our mother had reinforced this belief, always asking me to be understanding when Sophia's behavior crossed lines, to be the bigger person when conflicts arose. But I'd finally learned the difference between being loving and being a doormat. Love didn't require me to sacrifice my stability, my peace of mind, or my carefully constructed sanctuary to accommodate someone else's poor choices. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. "Where are you? We're getting hungry, and there's no food in this place. Also, do you have wine? Marcus is being weird without alcohol." I turned off my phone and sat down at my kitchen table, surrounded by the silence I'd worked so hard to create and protect. In 2 hours, Sophia and Marcus would return from whatever restaurant they'd chosen, expecting to walk back into my home like they owned it. Instead, they'd find themselves locked out, holding their bags, learning what boundaries actually looked like. They returned at sunset, their voices carrying across the quiet neighborhood as they approached my front door with the casual confidence of people who'd never encountered a boundary they couldn't cross. I watched from my living room window as Sophia juggled takeout bags, while Marcus fumbled with the keys I'd given them earlier, keys that no longer worked in locks that had been changed specifically to keep them out. "Bethany," Sophia called, her voice transitioning from confusion to irritation in the span of seconds. "The key isn't working. Did you break the lock or something?" I remained seated on my couch, book open in my lap, as they tried the door handle multiple times with increasing frustration. The sound of Marcus jiggling the key and Sophia's progressively louder demands created a symphony of entitlement meeting consequence. "Beth, I know you're in there. What the hell is wrong with this door?" The neighbors began to notice. Mrs. Patterson from next door appeared on her porch with the pretext of watering plants that clearly didn't need attention. The young couple across the street slowed their evening walk to observe the developing drama. Even Mr. Rodriguez, who usually minded his own business religiously, found reasons to linger near his mailbox. "This is ridiculous," Sophia announced to anyone within hearing distance. "My own sister has locked me out of her house like I'm some kind of criminal." She began knocking, first politely, then insistently, then with the kind of aggressive rhythm that suggested she was operating under the assumption that persistence would eventually yield results. Marcus tried to calm her down, his voice low and urgent as he undoubtedly realized they were creating a spectacle that would fuel neighborhood gossip for months. "Sophia, maybe we should just call her," he suggested, though even from inside I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "I'm not calling anyone," Sophia declared. "This is my family. I have a right to be here." A right. As if blood relation automatically granted access to someone else's sanctuary. As if being born to the same parents created permanent claims on each other's space and resources. I stood up and walked to the front door, speaking loudly enough to be heard through the thick wood. "I can hear you, Sophia. I'm sure the entire neighborhood can hear you." "Then open the goddamn door." "No." The simple word hung in the evening air like a declaration of independence. I'd never said no to Sophia before. Not directly, not without elaborate explanations or apologies or offers of compromise. Just no. Clean and final and non-negotiable. "What do you mean, no?" Sophia's voice rose to a pitch that probably had dogs barking 3 blocks away. "I'm your sister. We have nowhere else to go." "That's not my problem." I could hear her sharp intake of breath, the sound of someone who'd never been denied anything suddenly encountering an immovable object. In the pause that followed, I imagined her running through her usual arsenal of manipulation tactics. Tears, guilt trips, appeals to family loyalty, threats of consequences. "You can't do this," she said finally, her voice carrying a note of genuine disbelief. "You can't just lock family out on the street." "I can, and I have." Mrs. Patterson had abandoned all pretense of plant care and was now openly staring from her porch, probably memorizing every detail to share with her book club tomorrow. The young couple across the street had stopped walking entirely, their evening constitutional transformed into dinner theater. "Bethany, please," Marcus intervened, his voice careful and diplomatic. "Maybe we could just talk about this. I'm sure there's been some kind of misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," I replied through the door. "You assumed you could move into my home without invitation or permission. You assumed wrong. We're family," Sophia repeated, as if the word was a magic incantation that could unlock doors and dissolve boundaries. "This is what family does for each other." "No," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "This is what you do to family. You create chaos, then expect everyone else to clean it up. You make poor choices, then demand that other people absorb the consequences." The neighborhood had gone completely quiet, except for Sophia's increasingly frantic protests and the distant hum of evening traffic. I could picture the scene from an outsider's perspective, a woman in her 30s standing on a residential porch, holding suitcases and takeout bags, arguing with a locked door while strangers watched her personal drama unfold. "Fine," Sophia announced with the dramatic flair she'd perfected in high school theater. "Fine. Let everyone see what kind of person you really are, Bethany. Let them see how you treat your own sister. Let them see," I agreed, because for the first time in my life, I was more afraid of losing myself than I was of losing Sophia's approval, and that felt like the most honest thing I'd ever said. They eventually left, Marcus gently guiding Sophia away from my front door, as her protest dissolved into tears that may or may not have been genuine. I watched from my bedroom window as they loaded their bags into Marcus's aging Honda and drove away, leaving behind only the lingering smell of Chinese takeout and the echoes of family drama that would fuel neighborhood conversations for weeks. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I felt hollow, like someone who'd won a battle by burning down the entire battlefield. My phone buzzed constantly throughout the evening. 17 missed calls from Sophia, 4 from Marcus, and 2 from my Aunt Linda, who'd apparently been recruited as a mediator, despite not having spoken to me in 6 months. I let them all go to voicemail, unwilling to engage in the inevitable negotiations that would follow my unprecedented act of defiance. Instead, I found myself standing in my living room, looking at the family photos I kept displayed on the mantel, like evidence of a happiness that had never quite existed. There was Sophia and me as children, gap-toothed and grinning at some long-forgotten family gathering. Our mother between us, her arms around both daughters, looking tired but content, in the way mothers do when they're trying to hold everything together through pure force of will. The memories came flooding back, unbidden and unwelcome. I was 8 years old, Sophia was 5, and she'd taken my favorite doll, the one with red hair and green eyes that I'd saved allowance money for months to buy. I'd found it in her toy box with its hair cut off and permanent marker scribbled across its face. When I'd cried to our mother, she'd sighed and said, "Bethany, honey, you need to learn to share. Sophia is younger than you. Be the bigger person." I was 12, Sophia was 9, and she'd told her teacher that I'd stolen her homework when she'd actually forgotten to do it. The teacher had called our mother, who'd grounded me for a week despite my protests of innocence. When the truth eventually came out, Mom had sat Sophia down for a gentle conversation about honesty while I served the remainder of my punishment for not being more understanding of your sister's struggles. I was 16, Sophia was 13, and she'd borrowed my car without permission to impress some boy from her grade. She'd crashed it into a mailbox, causing $2,000 in damage that wiped out my college savings. Mom had made me apologize to Sophia for putting too much pressure on her by being upset about the accident. The pattern had been established early and reinforced consistently. Sophia's needs came first. Her emotions were more important. Her struggles deserved immediate attention and accommodation. I was the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who could be counted on to sacrifice my own needs for the family's stability. Our mother had died 2 years ago from cancer that she'd hidden until it was far too late for treatment. Even in her final months, she'd worried more about how Sophia would handle the loss than about whether I was coping with watching the only parent I'd ever trusted slip away one painful day at a time. "Promise me you'll take care of your sister," she'd whispered during one of our last conversations. "She's not as strong as you are. She needs someone to look out for her." I'd promised, of course. What else could I do? You don't argue with dying mothers about their assessment of their children's relative emotional resilience, but I'd been taking care of Sophia long before Mom's death, and the pattern had continued afterward with even less supervision or intervention. Sophia had moved in with me immediately after the funeral, treating my apartment like a hotel where she could process her grief without responsibility for rent, groceries, or basic household maintenance. She'd stayed for 8 months, during which time she'd maxed out 3 credit cards, quit 2 jobs, and begun dating a series of increasingly problematic men who treated my home like their personal crash pad. When I'd finally asked her to find her own place, she'd accused me of being selfish and heartless, of dishonoring Mom's memory by abandoning family in their time of need. The guilt had nearly destroyed me. I'd spent weeks second-guessing my decision, wondering if I was truly as cruel and selfish as Sophia insisted. It had taken months of therapy to understand that boundaries weren't betrayal, that love didn't require infinite accommodation, that taking care of someone didn't mean allowing them to take advantage. Now, standing in my carefully protected sanctuary, I realized that today's confrontation had been inevitable. Sophia would never voluntarily respect boundaries that inconvenienced her, and I would never again sacrifice my stability to accommodate her chaos. My phone rang again. Sophia, as predictable as sunrise. This time, I answered. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "Yes," I agreed. "We do." We met the next morning at Harbor View Cafe, a neutral location where Sophia's tendency toward dramatic confrontations would be constrained by the presence of strangers drinking overpriced lattes. She arrived 10 minutes late, looking like she'd slept in her car, which she probably had given their suddenly homeless status. Marcus wasn't with her, and I found myself grateful for his absence. This conversation needed to happen between sisters, without the complicating presence of a boyfriend who barely knew our family history, but felt obligated to offer opinions anyway. "You look terrible," I observed as Sophia slumped into the chair across from me. "Thanks. That's exactly what I needed to hear right now." She signaled the waitress with the imperious gesture of someone who'd never worked in food service and didn't understand that attitude determined tip percentages. We ordered coffee in silence, both of us gathering ammunition for a battle that had been building for 30 years. When the waitress left, Sophia launched into what was clearly a prepared speech about family loyalty and sisterly obligation. I let her talk, watching her animated gestures, and noting the way she'd styled her emotional appeals to maximum guilt-inducing effect. "Are you finished?" I asked when she finally paused for breath. "Bethany, you have to understand." "No, Sophia, you have to understand. For once in your life, you need to actually listen instead of just waiting for your turn to talk." She looked genuinely startled by the interruption. In our family dynamic, I was the listener, the accommodator, the one who absorbed everyone else's emotions and reflected them back in more manageable forms. "I'm listening," she said carefully. "Good. Then hear this. I'm done being your backup plan. I'm done being the person you call when your poor choices create consequences you don't want to handle. I'm done rearranging my life to accommodate your inability to maintain your own." Sophia's eyes filled with tears. Whether genuine or performative, I could no longer tell the difference. "Beth, you don't understand. This time is different. We're not just looking for a place to crash. We're in real trouble." "What kind of trouble?" She glanced around the cafe as if checking for surveillance, then leaned forward conspiratorially. "Marcus owes money to some very dangerous people. Gambling debts that have gotten completely out of control. They've been calling, making threats, showing up at his work." I felt a familiar sinking sensation in my stomach. "How much money?" $30,000. The number hung between us like a toxic cloud. $30,000 was more money than I'd ever had in savings, more than most people saw in a year, certainly more than someone like Marcus could earn at his part-time construction job. Jesus, Sophia. How did you get involved with someone who gambles away that kind of money? "I didn't know," she protested. "He seems so normal, so stable. He has a job, his own car. He's never asked me for money. I had no idea about any of this until 3 days ago when these men showed up at my apartment looking for him. The pieces were starting to form a picture I didn't want to see. So you brought his problems to my doorstep. We didn't have anywhere else to go. These people, Beth, they're not the kind who accept payment plans or negotiate extended terms. They want their money now, and if they don't get it," she shivered dramatically. "Have you considered that maybe you should leave Marcus to handle his own consequences instead of making them your problem?" Sophia's expression hardened. "I can't do that. I love him." Love. The word Sophia used to justify every poor decision, every boundary violation, every demand for accommodation from other people. She loved Marcus. Therefore, everyone else should help solve his gambling debts. She loved spontaneity. Therefore, I should accept her unannounced arrivals. She loved feeling supported. Therefore, I should sacrifice my own needs to provide that support. "Sophia, you've known this man for 3 months. Time doesn't matter when you find the right person," she said with the conviction of someone who'd found the right person at least 12 times in the past 5 years. "And you think hiding in my house is going to solve a $30,000 debt? We just need time to figure things out. Marcus has some leads on better paying work, and I'm looking into getting my real estate license. We could pay you back. Pay me back." The phrase that had become meaningless through decades of repetition without follow-through. Sophia had been going to pay me back for the stolen savings when we were teenagers, for the car repairs, for the security deposits on apartments, for the credit card bills she'd run up in my name. "Where is Marcus now?" I asked. "Staying with a friend from work, but it's not safe for him to be alone. These people are serious, Beth. They're not going to just forget about the money." I studied my sister's face, trying to separate genuine fear from manipulative performance. She looked exhausted and frightened, but Sophia had always been an excellent actress when the stakes were high enough. "I'm sorry you're in this situation," I said finally, "but I can't help you. Can't or won't. Both." After Sophia left the cafe, more angry than devastated, which told me everything I needed to know about the sincerity of her desperation, I drove home through streets that felt somehow different than they had 24 hours earlier. The same familiar route, the same traffic patterns, but I was seeing everything through the lens of someone who'd finally drawn a line in the sand and discovered the world didn't end when family members were forced to respect boundaries. My duplex looked smaller than usual as I pulled into the driveway, but also more precious. Every detail of the exterior reflected months of careful restoration work. The mailbox I'd repainted, the garden bed I'd weeded by hand, the porch swing I'd installed after saving for 6 months to buy quality hardware that would last decades. This wasn't just a house. It was proof that stability was possible, that chaos wasn't inevitable, that I could create something beautiful and maintain it, despite coming from a family that specialized in destruction. I unlocked my new locks and stepped into the sanctuary I'd fought to protect. The afternoon light streaming through my gauze curtains illuminated dust motes dancing in perfect stillness, and for the first time in years, I felt completely alone without feeling lonely. But Sophia's visit had stirred up memories I usually kept buried, and I found myself walking to the spare room that she'd so casually claimed as a guest bedroom. My art studio was exactly as I'd left it, easel positioned to catch the best natural light, brushes organized by size and type, canvases in various stages of completion lining the walls like windows into different emotional landscapes. I stopped in front of the painting I'd been working on for 8 months, the one that had consumed my evenings and weekends with the kind of obsessive focus I'd never been able to apply to anything else. It was a portrait, though not of anyone who existed in the physical world. The woman in the painting had my eyes but stronger features, my hands but steadier fingers, my expression but without the haunted quality that reflected decades of accommodating other people's chaos. She was the version of myself I was trying to become, confident, boundaried, unafraid to take up space in her own life. The painting had started as therapy homework, assigned by Dr. Martinez during one of our sessions about family dynamics and self-worth. Paint yourself as you want to be, she'd suggested, not as you think you should be to make other people comfortable, but as you actually want to exist in the world. It had taken me 3 months just to pick up a brush. I'd spent my entire life believing that wanting things for myself was selfish, that true love required infinite self-sacrifice, that being a good person meant never saying no to family members regardless of the cost to my own well-being. But slowly, layer by layer, I'd built this other version of myself on canvas. A woman who could love her family without being destroyed by them. A woman who understood the difference between being generous and being a doormat. A woman who could offer support without offering herself as a sacrifice. I'd never shown the painting to anyone, not even Dr. Martinez. It felt too raw, too revealing, like displaying my naked soul for public commentary. But working on it had taught me things about myself that years of therapy had only hinted at. I wasn't actually selfish or cruel, despite what Sophia's reactions might suggest. I was just someone who'd finally learned that love without boundaries wasn't love at all. It was codependency disguised as virtue. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Marcus. Can we talk? I think there are things about the situation you don't understand." I stared at the message for several minutes, weighing my options. Marcus had seemed like a decent enough person during the brief time I'd observed him, certainly more reasonable than most of Sophia's boyfriends. But he was also someone who'd accumulated $30,000 in gambling debts, and thought hiding in his girlfriend's sister's house was an appropriate solution. Still, something about the message felt different from Sophia's usual dramatic appeals. More thoughtful, less demanding. I typed back, "Coffee tomorrow morning, Harborview Cafe at 9 a.m. Come alone." His response was immediate. "Thank you. I'll be there." I set the phone aside and returned to studying my painting. This woman who looked like me but stronger. Tomorrow I would hear Marcus's version of events, and I would make decisions based on facts rather than guilt or family obligation. But tonight, I would sit in my protected sanctuary and remember what it felt like to choose myself for once. The silence in my house wasn't empty. It was full of possibility. Marcus arrived at the cafe precisely at 9, looking like someone who'd spent the night wrestling with decisions too large for comfortable resolution. He ordered black coffee and sat across from me with the careful posture of a man who understood he was requesting, rather than demanding, audience. "Thank you for meeting with me," he began, his voice quieter than I remembered from the previous day's drama. "I know you have every right to tell me to go to hell." "I haven't decided yet," I replied honestly. He managed a weak smile. "Fair enough. I want to start by saying that Sophia doesn't know I'm here. She thinks I'm at work." This surprised me. In my experience, Sophia's boyfriends rarely took independent action, preferring to let her orchestrate all family interactions while they remained safely in the background. "Why?" I asked. "Because there are things she doesn't know about the situation, and things she doesn't want to accept about your family's history." Marcus pulled out his phone and showed me a photograph of a legal document, a will, dated 3 years ago, with our mother's signature clearly visible at the bottom. "Where did you get this?" I asked, though I was already beginning to understand what I was looking at. "Sophia found it in her belongings after your mother died, but she's never shown it to you. She made me promise not to mention it, but after yesterday, I think you have a right to know what it says." I studied the document on his phone screen, reading through the legal language that I'd somehow never seen, despite handling most of Mom's funeral arrangements and estate settlement. According to the will, our mother had left her house, the family home where Sophia and I had grown up, specifically to me, along with instructions that Sophia should be allowed to live there rent-free for 1 year following Mom's death. 1 year, not indefinitely. 1 year to get her life together and find independent housing. This can't be right, I said, though even as I spoke, pieces of a puzzle I'd never known existed were beginning to form a coherent picture. Mom's house was sold to pay for her medical bills. The lawyer said there wasn't enough equity to leave anything to either of us. Marcus's expression grew uncomfortable. The house wasn't sold, Bethany. Sophia has been living there for the past 2 years, rent-free, claiming she's taking care of estate business that requires her presence. The coffee cup in my hand suddenly felt too heavy to hold. That's impossible. I have paperwork from the estate lawyer showing what Sophia wanted you to see, Marcus interrupted gently. She's been managing all the estate communications through a mail forwarding service, intercepting documents before they could reach you directly. The implications crashed over me like ice water. For 2 years, I'd believed that our mother's death had left both daughters financially devastated, that the medical bills had consumed every asset, that we were both starting over from zero. I'd watched Sophia struggle with housing instability and felt guilty about my own relative financial security, never knowing that she'd been living in a house she'd inherited specifically to share. Why would she lie about this? Marcus looked genuinely pained by the question. Because she was afraid you'd make her sell the house and split the proceeds. She knew the will specified that her rent-free year was meant to help her transition to independence, not to give her permanent ownership. She was hoping that if enough time passed, you'd never find out about the original terms. And the gambling debts are real, he admitted, but they're not the reason we came to your house yesterday. Sophia has been talking about moving in with you for months, saying it's time for the sisters to pool resources and live together like a real family. She sees your duplex as an upgrade from the old house, and she thought if she created enough crisis, you'd feel obligated to take us in. I felt sick, not just disappointed or angry, but physically ill at the realization that yesterday's drama had been orchestrated manipulation rather than genuine desperation. The dangerous men Marcus owes money to exist, but they're not as dangerous as Sophia made them sound. They're bookies, not mobsters. They want their money, but they're not going to break anyone's legs over it. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, looking like someone who'd carried this burden longer than he'd intended. I love Sophia, but I can't be part of lying to you anymore. She's been using your guilt about family loyalty to justify taking things that legally belong to both of you. Why are you telling me this? Because watching her manipulate you yesterday made me realize I don't know the person I thought I was in love with. And because you deserve to know that your mother trusted you enough to make you the primary beneficiary, even though she knew Sophia would need temporary help. I sat in silence, processing the revelation that my entire understanding of my family's financial situation had been based on lies. Our mother had trusted me with the family home, had seen me as responsible enough to handle the estate fairly, had provided for Sophia while ensuring I wasn't taken advantage of indefinitely. What do you need from me? I asked finally. Nothing, Marcus said, standing to leave. I just thought you should know the truth. I spent the rest of the day researching property records and estate law, calling the original estate attorney who'd handled Mom's affairs, and slowly piecing together the extent of Sophia's deception. By evening, I had documentation proving that Marcus was right. The family home had never been sold. Sophia had been living there rent-free for over 2 years, and I was legally entitled to either evict her or charge market-rate rent according to the terms of Mom's will. More importantly, I discovered that Sophia had been intercepting quarterly statements from investment accounts Mom had established for both of us, small trust funds that had been generating income for the past 2 years. Money that should have been split equally between sisters had been flowing entirely into accounts Sophia controlled. The total amount of theft, because that's what it was, regardless of family relationships, exceeded $40,000. When I called Sophia that evening, she answered on the first ring, her voice bright with the artificial cheer she used when she was preparing to make demands. Beth, I'm so glad you called. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I think I have a solution that could work for everyone. I'm sure you do, I said calmly. But first, I have some questions about Mom's will. The silence that followed lasted long enough for me to count to 15. When Sophia spoke again, her voice had lost all its manufactured brightness. What about the will? Specifically, the part where she left the house to me with instructions that you be allowed to live there rent-free for 1 year following her death. Not 2 years. Not indefinitely. 1 year. Another pause. This one even longer. I could practically hear Sophia's mind racing through possible responses, calculating which version of the truth might minimize the consequences of her lies. I can explain. I'm sure you can. Just like you can explain the investment account statements you've been intercepting, or the rent money you should have been paying me for the past 12 months, or the estate communications you've been hiding through a mail forwarding service. You've been investigating me? Sophia's voice rose to the indignant pitch she used when caught in behaviors she couldn't justify. What kind of sister hires lawyers to spy on family? The kind who finally realizes she's been systematically robbed by someone she trusted. Robbed? Bethany, how can you say that? We're family. That house is our family home. It belongs to both of us emotionally, regardless of what some legal document says. There it was, the familiar refrain that had justified decades of boundary violations and resource theft. Family trumped law, emotion superseded legal agreements, and my role was to sacrifice whatever was necessary to maintain Sophia's comfort. Mom's will was very specific about her intentions, I said. She wanted to help you transition to independence, not enable you to avoid responsibility indefinitely. Mom didn't understand how hard things would be after she died, Sophia protested. She thought 1 year would be enough for me to get back on my feet, but grief doesn't follow timelines. I needed more time to process everything, to figure out my life without her guidance, while stealing money from my inheritance to finance that processing. I wasn't stealing anything. That money has been sitting in accounts doing nothing. At least I was using it for practical purposes, maintaining the house, paying utilities, covering expenses that benefited both of us. Benefited me how, exactly? I've been living in a rental apartment, paying my own rent, while you lived rent-free in a house that legally belonged to me. Sophia's voice shifted tactics, moving from indignation to wounded vulnerability. I thought you understood that I needed more support than you did. I thought you wanted to take care of me like Mom asked you to. Don't you remember what she said before she died? Of course I remembered. Mom's final request that I take care of Sophia had shaped every interaction we'd had since the funeral. But I was beginning to understand that taking care of someone didn't mean allowing them to take advantage, and that Mom's intentions had been subverted by Sophia's manipulation. Taking care of you was supposed to mean helping you become independent, I said, not enabling you to remain dependent indefinitely while lying about the resources available to both of us. Fine, Sophia said, her voice hardening with anger. You want to talk about legal documents and inheritance rights? Let's talk about them. But don't pretend this is about justice or fairness. This is about you finally having the excuse you've always wanted to abandon your family obligations. What family obligations? The obligation to finance your lifestyle indefinitely, the obligation to absorb the consequences of your poor choices, the obligation to sacrifice my own stability to accommodate your chaos, the obligation to love your sister more than you love money and property and your precious little boundary projects. The accusation hit exactly where she'd intended, targeting the guilt I'd carried for years about prioritizing my own needs over family expectations. But for the first time, instead of absorbing the guilt and adjusting my behavior accordingly, I felt angry. No, Sophia. Love doesn't require me to enable your lies or theft. Love doesn't mean sacrificing myself to maintain your illusions. Real love includes accountability. Then I guess we have very different definitions of love, she said coldly, and hung up. 3 days later, I drove to our childhood home for the first time since Mom's funeral. I'd been avoiding the neighborhood, unable to face the memories contained in those familiar streets. But Sophia's lies had made the visit necessary. According to property records, I was the legal owner of a house I'd never seen since inheriting it. The family home looked smaller than I remembered, but well-maintained in a way that suggested someone had been investing time and money in its upkeep. The garden Mom had tended for 20 years was thriving. The exterior paint was fresh, and new windows had been installed at considerable expense. Sophia's car was in the driveway, parked next to a red sedan I didn't recognize. I sat in my own car for several minutes, gathering courage for a confrontation I'd been avoiding since our phone conversation 3 nights earlier. When I knocked on the front door, strange, knocking on the door of a house I now owned, it was answered by a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the kind of professional bearing that suggested authority in whatever field employed her. You must be Bethany, she said warmly, extending her hand. I'm Dr. Patricia Wells, Sophia has told me so much about you. I shook her hand, confused by the presence of a stranger in what should have been a private family confrontation. I'm sorry, but are you? Please come in. Sophia is in the living room waiting for you. I followed Dr. Wells through the hallway I'd walked thousands of times as a child, noting changes Sophia had made to the decor. The family photos I remembered had been replaced with artwork, and the furniture had been updated with pieces that looked expensive and carefully chosen. Sophia was seated on a new sofa, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd seen her since we were children. Her usual confidence was absent, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Thank you for coming, she said quietly. I know I don't deserve your consideration after everything, but there are things you need to understand before you make any final decisions about the house. Dr. Wells sat down across from us, pulling out a legal pad covered with notes. Bethany, I'm an estate attorney specializing in family inheritance disputes. Sophia retained my services because she believes there are aspects of your mother's intentions that weren't properly documented in the will. What aspects? I asked, though I was already feeling manipulated by the formal setup of this conversation. Your mother's mental state during the months before her death, Dr. Wells replied. According to Sophia, she was heavily medicated for pain management and may not have been competent to make complex legal decisions about property distribution. The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. You're claiming Mom wasn't mentally competent when she made her will? Sophia leaned forward, her eyes bright with tears that seemed genuine for the first time in years. Beth, you weren't there during the worst of it. You'd visit for an hour here and there, but I was living with her, watching her struggle with pain medication that made her confused and disoriented. The woman who signed that will wasn't the same person who raised us. She was cogent when I visited her, I protested. We had meaningful conversations right up until she died. During her good hours, Sophia agreed. But there were days when she didn't recognize me, when she thought I was still 13 years old, when she was convinced Dad was still alive and living in the basement. The medications affected her judgment in ways that weren't immediately obvious to casual visitors. Dr. Wells consulted her notes. If we can demonstrate that your mother lacked testamentary capacity when the will was executed, we can petition the court to invalidate the document and distribute the estate according to previous wishes she expressed when she was demonstrably competent. What previous wishes? Sophia reached into a folder on the coffee table and pulled out a handwritten document I'd never seen before. This is a letter Mom wrote to both of us 5 years ago, before her diagnosis, when she was completely healthy and clear-minded. She explicitly states that she wants the house to be shared equally between her daughters, with neither sister having authority to evict the other. I read through the letter, recognizing Mom's handwriting and the casual tone she used for family communications. The document was dated and signed, and it did indeed express wishes that differed significantly from the formal will's terms. Why didn't you show me this before? I asked. Because I hoped the will's terms would work, Sophia replied. I thought maybe you'd be satisfied with nominal ownership, while I handled the practical responsibilities of maintaining the property. But when you started investigating the estate documents, I realized you were planning to evict me, and I couldn't let that happen without fighting for what Mom really wanted. Dr. Wells leaned forward professionally. The question becomes whether your mother's final wishes should be honored, despite questionable mental competency, or whether her earlier, healthier intentions should take precedence. I looked around the living room where I'd spent my childhood, seeing it through the lens of legal ownership versus emotional belonging. The truth was, I'd never wanted to live in this house again. It held too many painful memories, too many reminders of family dysfunction and loss. But I also couldn't ignore the evidence that Sophia had been systematically lying to me for 2 years, stealing money and hiding assets while manipulating my guilt about family obligations. There's something else, Sophia said quietly. Something I should have told you years ago, but I was too afraid of how you'd react. She took a shaky breath before continuing. I'm not Dad's biological daughter. Mom had an affair during their marriage, and when Dad found out about my parentage, he left. He didn't abandon the family because of his own problems. He left because he couldn't handle raising another man's child. The revelation reframed everything I thought I understood about our family's history and dynamics. If Sophia wasn't Dad's biological daughter, then we were half-sisters, not full sisters, and the inheritance laws became even more complicated. Who is your biological father? I asked. Mom never told me his name. She said it didn't matter because Dad had been my father in every way that counted until he chose to leave. But it did matter, especially now, because it explained why Mom might have felt obligated to provide more support for Sophia while trusting me with greater legal responsibility for the estate. The shocking truth wasn't that Sophia had been lying about inheritance documents. It was that our entire family structure had been built on secrets that were finally being revealed. 6 months later, Sophia and I sat in the same cafe where this entire confrontation had begun, but the dynamic between us had shifted in ways I couldn't have imagined during those first angry conversations. The estate dispute had been resolved through mediation rather than litigation, with both sisters agreeing to compromises that honored both moms' intentions and the reality of our complicated family history. Sophia had agreed to pay back the money she'd taken from the investment accounts, but over a 5-year timeline that wouldn't force her into immediate financial crisis. In exchange, I'd agreed to let her remain in the family home for 2 more years, while she completed a nursing degree that would provide stable income for the first time in her adult life. More importantly, we'd both committed to family therapy with Dr. Martinez, who'd helped us understand how childhood dynamics and unresolved grief had shaped our destructive patterns of interaction. "I never wanted to steal from you," Sophia said, stirring sugar into her coffee with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to choose words thoughtfully. "I convinced myself that I was just borrowing money that would eventually be shared anyway, but I know that's not true anymore." The admission represented months of painful therapy sessions, where we deconstructed decades of manipulation, boundary violations, and codependent behaviors that had masqueraded as family love. Dr. Martinez had helped us understand that both sisters had been responding to childhood trauma in different, but equally damaging ways. "I know," I replied, "and I never wanted to abandon you, despite what you accused me of. I just needed to learn the difference between supporting you and enabling you." Sophia nodded, a gesture that would have been impossible during our early therapy sessions, when she'd still believed that love required unlimited accommodation of her needs. "Marcus and I broke up," she announced, though her tone suggested relief rather than heartbreak. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it despite my complicated feelings about their relationship. "Don't be. You were right about him, and about me. I was using the relationship to avoid dealing with my own problems, and he was using it to avoid dealing with his. Neither of us was capable of actual love until we learned to take responsibility for our own lives." The change in Sophia was remarkable, but not unbelievable. Therapy had revealed that her manipulative behaviors weren't evidence of inherent selfishness, but rather survival strategies she'd developed as a child to navigate a family system that had never taught her healthier ways to get her needs met. "How's nursing school?" I asked. "Harder than I expected, but in a good way. It's the first time I've ever committed to something that required sustained effort without immediate gratification." She smiled ruefully. "Turns out I'm actually capable of discipline when I'm working towards something meaningful, rather than just trying to avoid responsibility." I pulled out my phone and showed her a photograph of the art studio I'd set up in my duplex's second bedroom, the space Sophia had tried to claim as a guest room during that dramatic confrontation 6 months earlier. "I finished the painting," I said, scrolling to an image of the self-portrait I'd been working on for over a year. Sophia studied the photo carefully, seeing the woman I'd painted who looked like me but stronger, more confident, unafraid to take up space in her own life. "She looks like you," she said finally, "but also like who you were meant to become." "That's exactly what she is." We sat in comfortable silence, 2 sisters who'd learned to love each other without destroying themselves in the process. The family home where Sophia lived was being slowly renovated with money from the investment accounts she was repaying, transforming it from a repository of painful memories into something that honored our mother's legacy while acknowledging our own growth. "Beth," Sophia said, as we prepared to leave the cafe, "I want you to know that I understand now why you changed the locks that day. It wasn't about rejecting me. It was about protecting something you'd built for yourself. And I understand now why you were so desperate to stay," I replied. "You weren't just looking for free housing. You were looking for family connection in the only way you knew how to ask for it." We hugged goodbye in the parking lot, a gesture that felt genuine rather than obligatory for the first time in years. As I drove home to my carefully protected duplex, still my sanctuary, but no longer my fortress, I reflected on how drastically my definition of family love had evolved. Real love, I'd learned, included accountability. It included boundaries. It included the courage to disappoint people when necessary to preserve your own ability to function. It included the wisdom to distinguish between supporting someone and enabling them, between generosity and self-sacrifice, between loyalty and codependency. Most importantly, it included the understanding that you couldn't save anyone who didn't want to be saved, but you could love them while protecting yourself from the consequences of their choices. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. "Thank you for not giving up on us. Even when giving up would have been easier." I typed back, "Thank you for doing the work to become someone worth not giving up on." For the first time in our 35 and 32 years as sisters, we were building a relationship based on choice rather than obligation, on mutual respect rather than guilt and manipulation. It felt like coming home to ourselves.